for joining our national tele-town hall. There are so many difficulties and challenges facing our nation, and our hearts and our hopes and our prayers are out there on those. Today, we're focusing on one very specific issue, and that is the issue of whether or not the federal government will do a $2 or $3 or $4 trillion bailout of big spending states and cities. Nancy Pelosi, many of you probably saw that just a few weeks ago, pushed through the House a $3 trillion bill, bailing out big spending states and cities, and also including a veritable Christmas tree wish list of ideological left projects that she wants. The focus is now on the United States Senate. At Americans for Prosperity, have launched an effort called Reject Bailouts. You can go to rejectbailouts.com to join this effort, to tell your 2 senators and House member to do just that. At Americans for Prosperity, we have staff across 35 states, from Anchorage, Alaska to Miami, Florida, and everywhere in between. Today, with me on this call is the state director of our great Americans for Prosperity Utah chapter. That's Heather Andrews. Heather, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Tim. You always do such a great job, and proud to be a part of this grassroots organization with you. As you may or may not know, here in Utah, we're often recognized as a fiscally responsible state. We've had budget surpluses the last several years, as well as a pretty sizable rainy day fund for times like these where we're seeing the economy slow down due to this horrible pandemic. I know a lot of Utahns are concerned and upset and don't believe it's fair we're even discussing bailing out states that have been fiscally irresponsible for decades, states like California, Illinois, and others. A lot of people in Utah, and I'm sure nationally, are counting on Utah Senator Mike Lee to vote no on this massive bailout proposal. I, for one, am grateful to have a senator who not only represents Utah's fiscally responsible principles and values in the Senate, but also many individuals who feel the same across the country. Despite consistent opposition, Senator Lee fights to preserve America's founding document in the United States Senate. He consistently advocates efforts to support constitutionally limited government, fiscal responsibility, individual liberty, and economic prosperity. Gratefully, Senator Lee knows that success for America will not come from the marble halls of Congress or the West Wing of the White House, but from the living rooms and classrooms across the country. People standing for principles is the secret sauce of America. It's a privilege and an honor to introduce and welcome Senator Mike Lee to the call. Senator?
Thanks so much, Heather. I really appreciate AFP and all that your members, your volunteers, your organization does to promote the principles of freedom and free markets that have made our country strong and that have helped bring about the most successful experiment in constitutionally limited government that human beings have ever known. We have today an existential threat of sorts to the way that we've come to view government. One of the many ways in which that threat has manifested itself is through legislation moving through the House of Representatives that has been passed out by the House of Representatives that would spend trillions of additional dollars that we don't have. We're talking on the order of $3 trillion or so of money that hasn't yet been earned, and much of which would have to be paid back by people who are not yet old enough to vote, or in some cases by people who not only have yet to turn 18, but who haven't even been born. This is a really nasty form of taxation without representation. Last time I checked, we fought a war over that. We won that war. This type of deliberate concentration of power and of capital in Washington, D.C. is dangerous to our economy, and it almost always is accompanied by and itself accomplishes a lot of bad things. And so that's why one of the impulses that I think is so important for us to figure out how to resist, how to push back on in our society is the impulse when something bad happens, something like the coronavirus,
to immediately assume that a government response is necessary and that the government response that's in order necessarily needs to be a federal response, and that that federal response needs necessarily to involve trillions of dollars of new spending. This involves so many different levels of self-deception and of self-sabotage that I really worry about those who have decided that this is a good idea. So I think the HEROES Act is something that we need to not only oppose on its own merits, because it itself is bad legislation. We need to push back even on the very idea that that it's the federal government's role to step in and borrow trillions of additional dollars in the name of creating new jobs. It's just not how it works, and I hope we can win that argument.
Great. Well, let me ask you a question. So most Americans, want to obviously support brave first responders, along with like doctors and nurses who have been on the front lines of this pandemic. But tell us about what Congress has already done to appropriate. I feel like they've appropriated hundreds of billions of dollars for states and localities to do just that.
Yeah, so look, we've already spent, appropriated something in the neighborhood of about $3 trillion in connection with COVID-19. And of that, something in the neighborhood of $1.2, $1.3 trillion has actually gone out the door, has actually been spent. But the rest of it hasn't, and there remains additional spending authority to be handled by the Federal Reserve Bank that wasn't appropriated by Congress, but that still is there and can provide financial support within our country. And so as a result of that, we can't approach this from the default assumption that it's the HEROES Act or nothing. Congress has already done a lot. One can argue that we spent a lot more than we should have. It's certainly true that we spent a lot more than we have access to. We're running a record high deficit. We were already before we reached this point, and this is only going to make that worse. Now, you can make an argument that what we've done so far is defensible. We didn't know exactly how bad it was going to be going into it. But regardless of how you feel about that, I think most people on this call can probably agree it doesn't make any sense to decide to spend more while about half of the money we've appropriated so far still has yet to be spent. And we don't know exactly what impact that's going to have. We shouldn't reflexively, instinctively trust government to handle anything and everything. And I think one of the things that's been lost in our civil discourse today, our public discourse, is a healthy degree of skepticism on what government is and what it can do, what its capacity is. Government doesn't love you. It doesn't have the capacity to be either good or evil. It's run by fallible, mortal human beings. Government is necessary, but government is force. That's all it is. It's organized, collective, official force. Now, sometimes you need force. I'm not opposed to government categorically, but I am opposed to using government for things for which government is not equipped. And the minute you rely excessively on the official, collective, organized use of force that government provides, even if it's for a benevolent purpose, that inevitably is going to increase the risk of other problems down the road, because that's the only tool government has. It's the only tool it knows is force. And we should always be wary of that.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, you were just hearing from Senator Mike Lee of the great state of Utah. I'm Tim Phillips with Americans for Prosperity. You're on a live telephone town hall. Thousands of you have joined us from across the country and certainly all across Utah as well. We're glad you're on with us. We're discussing this crucial effort to stop what initially the House has passed, a $3 trillion bailout of big spending states, localities. But Senator, many in the Senate, Leader McConnell and others have said the Pelosi bailout is dead on arrival, and that's good to hear. But there's a lot of worry that, a lot of the Senate could be open to some form of, and I'm putting air quotes up, compromise bill, that maybe it's not $3 trillion, but maybe it's only, I use the word only with a lot of sarcasm, only $1.5 trillion or $1.8 trillion. Do you feel there's a decent block of senators who will, like you, will just say no to any really further bailouts? We agree with you, by the way, when you say the initial CARES Act had a lot of very defensible points to it. We agree with that. We're just saying that moving forward, it just doesn't make more sense. But where do you think we stand on being able to stop even a mini-type Pelosi bailout?
Well, that's a good question. I am concerned about something like that moving forward. If we're going to stand persuasively on this point, I don't think it's very helpful for us to simply point out that the HEROES Act was bad, but that we can do it more efficiently. In other words, I think the most principled stance to take on this one is one that says, look, until all this money that we've already appropriated has been spent, and until we've been able to evaluate what impact it's having and where it's working and where it isn't, we shouldn't spend another dollar on this. I found discouraging the news reports over the weekend that you're referring to. The news reports of people saying in the same breath, yeah, the $3 trillion bill passed by the House is unacceptable for many of the same reasons I've just stated. And so what that means is we'll spend at most $1 trillion of additional money. I hope that that is not an indication that my Republican colleagues, or even any significant number of them, have just resigned themselves to that fact, because I think that's the wrong position to take. We don't win elections and we don't achieve good government by being slightly less inefficient socialists than our Democratic colleagues. We win elections and we develop good policy and we restore free markets by standing behind principle and at least standing behind the general understanding that you can't just continue to spend money every time you see a problem without any accountability following that money.
Agreed. Yes. Well, at Americans for Prosperity, we've had over 340,000 grassroots activists contact their senators and House members, urging them to reject bailouts. Senator, you talk daily with your colleagues. Do you know what is the impact on them when so many of their constituents contact, on an issue like this?
Well, I think it's helpful, especially when they're hearing from a group like AFP, because they know that people involved with AFP take principled stands on things, and that there are also people who are active in their communities, in their states, and in the country. And they know that people aligned with AFP have studied issues out very carefully. And so I think calls making the kinds of points that you've encouraged your volunteers and your members to make really do end up having an impact, particularly when you remember that there are so many bad policies in Washington as to which there are concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. I wish I could come up with a better term to describe that phenomenon, but when there are a small handful of people who are going to grow really wealthy or otherwise benefit tremendously from a particular program, but it will cost your average American relatively less money. I don't know, $2 or $50 or $100 or whatever the price tag is attached to the program at issue. It's very easy for the arguments urging restraint to get drowned out in the sea of the people encouraging the project. As some people say in Utah, here's a political analogy I'll draw here, that when 2 or 3 people start whispering in someone's ear to run for office, that group of 2 or 3 people might sound like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And there is a corollary here to that. When you've got 2 or 3 businesses or chambers of commerce or special interests of one sort or another, all clamoring for a particular type of government policy. It might sound like a huge heavenly choir, especially when those urging government restraint and caution are drowned out by them.
You were just hearing from United States Senator Mike Lee from Utah. I'm Tim Phillips at Americans for Prosperity. And Senator Lee was just talking about how it matters when you make your voice heard to your senators. There are thousands of folks on this call right now, and you can do that right now. Just press the number 1 on your phone, the number 1. That will send a petition toll-free to you, no charge to you, to both of your United States senators and to your House member in the United States House of Representatives. Just press 1. The message is simple and succinct. You're telling them to reject these bailouts for big spending states and cities. That's it. So just press 1. Join that petition today. It's so important. Senator, you mentioned briefly the deficits and debt. I think a lot of times people wonder, does it really matter? You know, does it really matter if our national debt is exploding, you know, toward $30 trillion? Does that really at some point harm our nation? Because it doesn't seem to so far. Can you take a moment and answer that?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, keep in mind that last year we as a country paid a little over somewhere between $300 and $350 billion in 2019 on interest on our national debt. It's an enormous amount of money. I mean, that amount of money dwarfs most federal programs, including many federal programs that are part of the core operation of government. But that's not the scary part. The scary part is that it was only somewhere in the range of $300 to $350 billion. In other words, our annual interest payment last year on our national debt was not that much higher than it was, say, 20 years ago when our national debt was a small fraction of its current size, like along the order of maybe a seventh of its size in 2019. So the scary part about this is that the only reason our interest payments are as low as they are, notwithstanding the fact that our debt has ballooned out of control, is that our Treasury yield rates, the rate at which we have to pay those buying U.S. Treasury bonds, is at all-time historic lows. These are aberrational lows. And at some point, the laws of mathematics will catch up with us, especially as we continue to accumulate more debt. If we accumulate debt at a much faster rate, we approach that date much more rapidly. The point that I worry most about is the point where all of a sudden our Treasury yield rates start to return to their historic average. It won't take very long. I mean, we're talking within a year or two after our Treasury yield rates just return to their historic norm before we go from spending about $300 billion a year on interest on our national debt to over $1 trillion a year in interest on our national debt. Just that difference between our current payment and whatever we'll be paying at that moment, $700 billion or so, that's going to end up exceeding what we spend on defense in an entire year. There is not enough money that we could plausibly collect. There's not a tax increase imaginable that would cover that. One way or another, we'll be looking at massive, abrupt, draconian, painful cuts that will hurt American poor and middle-class Americans, or we'll be looking at printing more money to print our way out of it, or borrowing more money. Every one of those things will have its own spillover effects, and the one commonality between them will be hurting America's poor and middle class. We don't want to get to that point. And so we need to start turning this problem around right now, and that doesn't mean throwing down another $3 trillion before this $3 trillion is even spent.
Agreed. All right, well, let's go to questions from people on the line. Our operator, Kevin, can you recognize the first person who'd like to ask the question for Senator Lee?
Sure thing. And just as a reminder to anyone on the call who may have a question, if you press *3, you'll be added to the queue, and you can ask that question to the senator. First up, we've got Jacob from Highland, Utah. Jacob, you are on live with Senator Lee.
Hello, Jacob.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Senator Lee, for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate all that you do. Has a vote been scheduled on the latest bailout bill? And if so, when is it likely up for a vote in the Senate?
Jacob, a vote has not been scheduled on the HEROES Act or on any other new round of bailout packages. We're being told by Senator McConnell not to expect moving to any of this until the last 2 weeks of July. And so I anticipate that we're at least a month away, a little bit more than a month away from the time when we're likely to vote on anything like that.
All right, Kevin, next question.
Yep, up next we've got Justin from Bozeman, Montana. Justin, you are live.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Senator Lee, I'm concerned by the sheer size of the federal spending that has already occurred, and now the trillions more being considered. Do members of Congress not understand or care about the deficits and debt?
The short answer is no. Individual members will tell you that they do, and on some level they do, and that they feel some sense that this could end badly. But unless or until members start feeling like their job depends on it, meaning depends on restraining their impulse to spend more, then they're going to continue to spend more, even when they probably shouldn't. And it has been really discouraging for me to see how little people tend to speak of this. But, that can change in a hurry. When there starts to be more of a public outcry about what Congress is not doing, members will turn on a dime as soon as they feel like their own seats might be in jeopardy over it.
Kevin, do we have anyone else on the line for the senator?
Yep, we've got Joey next from Oklahoma City. Joey, you are on.
Hi, Senator Lee. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. I've seen mayors like de Blasio from New York City and governors like Newsom from California threaten to lay off first responders if they don't get more bailout money. And I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but haven't they already gotten billions to help out with that specifically a couple months ago?
Yes, Joey, in the last round, the Phase 3 legislation for COVID-19, there were many billions of dollars sent out, tens of billions of dollars sent out specifically to states and municipalities to help address this. And so it's not as if they haven't gotten anything. What worries me now is that there has been talk of just giving money to the states and municipalities simply to deal with revenue shortfalls and simply to make up the difference between whatever it is that they regard as their necessary spending levels and what they're able to bring in. I think that's very dangerous, and that's one of the features of the HEROES Act that I consider most dangerous. You see, because that would end up obliterating any and all meaningful distinction between what is state and what is federal. One of the reasons why this is such a risky gambit is because the reason they want to approach the federal government for this is that the federal government essentially has the ability to print more money. It's slightly more complicated than that, of course. It involves going through the Federal Reserve and issuing bonds through the Treasury Department and having some of those bonds bought back up on the secondary market by the Federal Reserve. But at the end of the day, it's a form of printing more money. That's why they want to come to us, because we have the ability to print money and the states don't. But if we do that, we will be basically rewarding those states that are not cautious, are not careful, and will be encouraging more of that. But even worse than that, Joey, we will be setting a precedent from which we'll never really be able to retreat. Everything, if you can dream it, you can do it. At any government level, they'll just come to Washington and ask us to pay for it. And I think that is a real concern that we ought to worry about.
Yes, agreed. Well, this is Heather Andrews with Americans for Prosperity, Utah, State Director here. I'm just going to ask the last question for Senator Lee because I know he's got to get back to work. So we know what Congress should not do, which is state bailouts, but what would you recommend Congress do moving forward to battle the pandemic and economic crisis?
Look, the best thing that Congress could do would be to encourage economic growth. The best way that I know of to do that would be to enact very significant sweeping regulatory reform. The federal regulatory system costs the American economy an estimated $2 trillion a year. This is money that goes right out the door. It doesn't necessarily lead to other economic activity. It mostly enriches a small handful of lawyers, accountants, lobbyists, and compliance specialists. It's bad for everybody else. And these are paid, moreover, not by big corporate fat cats or billionaires. They're really paid ultimately by America's poor and middle class, who pay for them in terms of higher prices on goods and services, diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. The very best solution I can come up with on this to achieving both short-term and long-term economic stimulus would be for the federal government to enact sweeping regulatory reform legislation like under the REINS Act. The REINS Act is an acronym. It stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. And it says that anytime a federal agency issues a rule carrying the force of generally applicable federal law, if it's going to have a major economic impact as measured by the Office of Management and Budget, it couldn't be self-executing. It would have to go through Congress. It would have to be affirmatively enacted into law by Congress. That would start to rein in the problem that we have with the regulatory system. I can think of no better, more easily implemented and type of a reform than this one, particularly when you take into account the high-end economic benefit that could come from that, both in the short term and in the long term. This would help us recover from COVID better than just about anything I can think of. We've already had something of a start with this. The Trump administration has suspended the implementation and enforcement of certain regulations deemed non-essential during the COVID-19 epidemic. And if it can reform regulations on a short-term basis, we should be able to reform them on a long-term basis. To do that, we really need to pass the REINS Act.
Senator Lee, we completely agree on making some of the regulatory changes that have been made temporary permanent. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the good work you're doing in the United States Senate. And we are proud to partner with you on so many issues, including this one of trying to rein in the federal spending that, as you pointed out a few moments ago, could literally harm our ability to defend our nation and have our country as we see it today. So thank you, sir, for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Tim Phillips with Americans for Prosperity. I mentioned earlier, if you have not joined the petition to reject bailouts, so it'll go straight to your two senators and your House member, just press 1 on the phone now. There's no charge to you. Press 1. You'll join the over 340,000 of your fellow citizens who've done that. I'll close this out by asking Heather Andrews, our Utah Americans for Prosperity, the last question. And Heather, I mentioned at the very beginning, we face some big challenges in our nation, including this issue of pushing through the economic crisis and pandemic. You're out across Utah literally every day with folks in that great state. Give us a sense of why you're hopeful and optimistic for our nation's future.
Oh, thank you, Tim. I appreciate that question. I think it's just, I'm hopeful because I'm a single mom of 4 kids. I look at my kids and I see, the future is bright for them. I think our best days in America are ahead. And again, I see people, you know, through this pandemic helping, you know, neighbors in need, friends in need, you know, the religious communities really stepping in to fill gaps. But I see people getting engaged and educated and informed on issues like this and then taking action. And that's why I'm grateful to work for Americans for Prosperity, because we, you know, believe in the grassroots. We believe in people who will step up, get involved, volunteer, and take action where needed to push back and fight for these constitutionally limited government principles and fiscal accountability in Congress. So that's why I'm hopeful.
Well said. That was Heather Andrews, our Americans for Prosperity State Director in Utah. I'm Tim Phillips, the National President, and you were listening also to Senator Mike Lee. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's go win the future for our nation. Goodbye, everybody.